Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Doyelstown Bookshop's virtual event series. We are so excited to welcome award-winning and New York Times bestselling author John Scalzi, who is with us to discuss the third and final book in his Interdependency Series, The Last EMPEROX, which was released on April 14th. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Life's pretty good at the moment. I've been having, this is basically the very tail end of me doing all of these events for the book. So I have all my answers ready. So
Good. And how have you been holding?
I got my cat just meowed, so I'm going to let her in. She may do a cameo appearance, just so you know.
That may happen over here too.
Were you about to ask how I was holding up in the quarantine?
I was.
You were, and the answer to that is I've actually been holding up pretty well. The funny thing about being a writer is I spend all my time at home in a room by myself and only see my cats and my spouse and child. So in many ways, quarantine hasn't been all that different from how I live my life on a day-to-day basis. But the thing about it is, of course, there's a difference between I'm going to my room to write a novel and you won't see me for 3 months, as opposed to I am trapped in the house because, disease. Right. One feels like, I am creating art. The other is, if you go out, you'll die. So existentially, it's different, even if the day-to-day stuff has been pretty much the same. But they're beginning to do the opening up thing, which on one sense is good, but on the other sense makes me really nervous because the virus is still out there. Mm-hmm. But we'll see how it goes. In the meantime, though, of course, I've been doing these events, which have been actually more fun than I thought they would be. I usually do a live tour, and right. Obviously we can do that this time. So we've been doing the virtual events. And they've actually been, it's been surprising to me just how enjoyable that they have been. It helps to have back and forth, which is what we'll be doing tonight. So, but yeah, generally speaking, it's been a lot of fun. I'm having a good quarantine. What can I say?
Goodness. So we are here to talk about The Last EMPEROX. Is there anything you want to tell me about the book that's not in the blurb, that's not in the book description?
I will say that one of the things that I really enjoyed about this series as a writer, the whole Interdependency series, so Collapsing Empire, the Consuming Fire, and then this book, has been that this is the very first time that I've written a series where I knew it was going to be a series. Like I have other series, like I've got the Lock-In series, and I've got the Old Man's War series, and I have a series of audio novellas called The Dispatcher. The second of which will be coming out later this year. But in each of those cases, what happened was I wrote a standalone book, and then my publisher came back to me and said, "You should write more because we did well with those, and we all like money." And I was like, "Can't argue with that." And then second book and third book and so on and so forth. But this one was the first time that I came in saying, not only am I going to write a first book, but there are going to be other books, and there's actually going to be arc that's going to be a multi-book arc. And that was actually really cool to do. It was really, really great to be able to say, okay, this stuff's going to happen in the first book. This is going to happen in the second book. This is going to happen in the third book. There's definitely going to be an arc to things. There was still room for spontaneity. Stuff happened that I didn't know was going to happen until I started writing it. But by and large, I knew that it was going to take place over 3 books. And that was actually really kind of freeing and really intriguing for me as a writer. I think it might have been frustrating for the readers from time to time because the first 2 books I definitely ended both on cliffhangers. And people were like, "What? You ended it like this? How could you do this? You're a terrible person." And I'm like, I know there's going to be 3 books. So, unless I get, eaten by a bear, I know that the last book's going to happen. So for me, from a storytelling point of view and from a craft point of view, that was the most exciting thing about it, to be able to do that arc and have the characters develop over 3 books, and to know that seeds that were planted in the first book would bloom in book 3. And that was just, like I said, just a really great reading experience for me, or a writing experience for me. Reading it too, actually, because I read it as I go along, and I really like the characters this time around too.
So when you're setting out to write a series, how much time do you find you spend world building, and do you outline it like by book, or you just kind of have an idea of the series as a whole when you begin?
Right. So, so this being the very first time that I've actually known that I was going to actually write for a 3-book series, I did do a fair amount of world building, more than I usually do. I mean, usually when people are like, so tell us about your outlining process. And my outlining process is I sit down and I start writing, and I get continually surprised about the things that happen, right? I literally just make it up as I go along. But this time I was like, no, there are going to be 3 books. You really should have an idea where things are going, because this, of course, is the dirty secret about trilogies or multi-book installments, where everybody's like always says, oh yeah, well, we absolutely know where everything's going to go and what's going to happen. And you get the idea is like nobody knows anything. They're just like flying by the seat of their pants. And sometimes that means that you get to the 3rd book or the 5th book or the 7th book, whatever it is, and you kind of look at it and go, that I've invested all this time for this. So I knew going in that I wanted to make sure that I knew for my own satisfaction where this was going and how, in a very general sense, it was going to end up, so that at the end of 3 books, I would land where I wanted to land, and that I could, no matter what else happened in the books, I could promise the readers that there would be kind of that satisfactory ending. So I ended up doing a lot more world building than I usually do. And for me, the world building process is much less about like sitting there with a pad of paper, like scoping it out chapter by chapter or something like that, as it is kind of immersing myself into, well, how does this universe work? How are these people going to combat this crisis? How is the aristocracy going to respond to this? How are the normal people going to respond to this? All of those sorts of things, and just rolling it around in my head. And I did that we signed the contract for these books, as well as a number of other books, in 2015. I started thinking about the books, and I probably thought about them for a good year before I started writing them. I finished them in November of 2016, and they were published in April of 2000. The first one was published in April of 2017. So about a year's worth of thinking about it, and how the universe would build, and what the ending would be. So I always knew what the end would be. And it's not a spoiler. When you name your first book in a series The Collapsing Empire, guess what the empire has to do at the end? It's got to collapse. So it's not a spoiler to say, in fact, the empire collapses, but it's everything around the collapse of that particular empire that's interesting, and how we proceed from there. And like I said, that was a new experience for me, because like I said, with the exception of one other book where I did substantial world building, and that was the Lock-In series, because it was near future, and you have to do more world building for the near future than for far off in the future, because in near future, you're still going to be alive when the events are supposed to happen. So with the exception of that, like I said, I've always just kind of flown by the seat of the pants. And so to actually have such in-depth thinking about the world that I was creating was really kind of a new thing for me.
Oh. I do want to mention, I forgot to mention in the beginning, that if you would like to ask John a question, you can do so by entering it into the chat box, or at the bottom of the screen, there is the Ask a Question button you can click on. Also, if you would like to purchase your copy of The Last EMPEROX, please click the button on your screen that says Purchase Book Here.
Yes,
Had
do.
to plug it.
Please support the bookstore. It's how it works, right?
It is how it works.
It is how it works. I'm not just here to talk about my book. I'm here to talk about your bookstore, which it's really been interesting. So my local bookstore, we did a thing with them where we had, I would sign and personalize the books and so on and so forth, because the whole idea was like they were in quarantine it was difficult. You know, I wanted to support my local bookstore, so that's one of the things that I did for them. And I think it's been really interesting watching people who know, right, about, you know, it's like in the quarantine, you do need to support your local businesses. Like, you know, go pick up the books, go pick up, you know, the food, go support the people that are actually in your community. So I've been heartened, at least, by the response that I've seen by people actually supporting their bookstores and supporting their local businesses. So if you're one of those people who has been doing that, thank you very much.
It's been amazing. We could have never, well, no one could have anticipated any of this, but the support we've gotten, we have had through online orders has been amazing. We were able to keep, people working in the store, only a few at a time, safely,
Sure.
but we were able to keep people working. The owner of the store has been fantastic in supporting us and making sure we still have jobs. And then transitioning to, because we're a very event heavy store, so transitioning to virtual events, which I'm thinking we'll be doing for quite a while until things get back to whatever they'll be.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that's right. I mean, I think people did do the thing that once they went into their homes and they were like, you know, well, what am I going to do? It's like, well, what is everybody else going to do? And what can I do to, you know, to make sure to help other people get through this thing? I know that for us, it was very important for us to support the local bookstore and to support the local restaurants, particularly, and all the other things that we were doing, because, you know, they're having a hard time with it as well. And I think that's really been the silver lining of everybody has been alone, but they've been alone together, and it's really made a huge difference. And it was, you know, and I have to say, speaking as someone who was releasing a book in the middle of April, right, which was like smack dab in this thing where I was like, I'm not gonna lie, I generally, you know, they canceled my live tour. And because of course they had to, and I was like, well, that's it for the book. I mean, we've had a good run, you know, it's still a good book. People will find it 3 years from now. It'll be fine. And one of the things that I was genuinely surprised by, and I think that even my publisher was surprised by, was people were like, no, we're not going to wait until it comes out in paperback. We're getting it now. We have time. We're at home, you know, and whatever it was. And so we actually, the third book in the series, Last Emperor, it did better than the first two books in the first couple of weeks, right? You know, people really came through with that. And we've actually seen that a lot with books in general. I know Martha Wells has had the Murderbot series come out, and it also hit the New York Times bestseller list as well. So it's been, not only has it been heartening to see people respond to, you know, local businesses and local bookstores, but it's also been really heartening to see them respond to books, not just my book and not just Martha's book, but just books in general. Books really seem to be having a moment here in the quarantine world. And I was super grateful and just thrilled. And I'm so glad that my pessimistic expectation of it was a nice run was completely wrong. It's been selling like the proverbial hotcakes, and I'm just like so thrilled. I was like, and so is my electric bill. Thank you, everybody.
That is a silver lining. People have rediscovered their love for reading, you know, and they're really, they have time to dive into it. And I have to say, on the business end of thing, the publicists have been hustling. They have been working so hard to put these virtual tours together. It's been amazing what they've been able to do to support the authors and the bookstores too. Everybody's just really, you know, everyone, okay, this is what we've got. We're going to think on our feet and we're going to make it work. You know, we're going to hop on.
I gotta agree with you 100% there. You are absolutely right. And also in this particular case, specifically the marketing and publicity people at Tor, and specifically Alexis Srila, who is my personal publicist. I have to say, you know, so here's the funny story, which is I was on a cruise ship when my tour got canceled. I got an email from my editor, Patrick Nielsen Hayden. He says, you have to call me like immediately. And this was March 11th or 12th. And I responded, I'm like, I'm in the middle of the ocean. There are no cell phone towers. Just tell me what's going on. And when I got onto this cruise, which people, by the way, were like, "Are you insane? Why are you going on a cruise?" And I was like, "They didn't say it couldn't, you know." And we were like literally one of the last ships out and one of the last ships
Wow.
to come back in. But but I had made myself a promise. I'm not going to read the news while I'm going to have my moment on this boat where I'm not looking at the world. But I left the email open so that if something happened, then I could find out about it. And literally, so Patrick then tells me, you know, in an email, he's like, "Your tour is canceled. It's not just your tour; it's everybody's tour is canceled. It's, you know, you've been at sea. The world has changed. It's been 4 months since last Monday, and this was on a Wednesday night. And you know, and I was like, well, now I need to know. And then I checked the mail, and of course, you know, or I checked the news, and of course, everything had changed. You know, the NBA and the Final Four got canceled. Everything got canceled, and I was like, well, it's not, you know, it's not just me. So I, like I said, I was like, well, that's it for the tour, and that's going to be that. But almost immediately, the tour people and bookstores and everybody was like, well, this is what we have, let's make it work. And they've been doing a great job. And it's been, like I said, it's been really interesting because the dynamic is different. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before. You guys don't know this, but we had a dress rehearsal for this a couple of days ago where we just made sure that we had a connection, not a personal connection, like an actual internet connection, so we could, like, you know, do this thing. But the thing that, you know, we were talking about what works in this sort of events and what's not. And like one of the things that I do in like my normal events or my live events is I'll do a reading because the audience is there and I can see them and I can get a little bit of feedback and back and forth. But the couple of times that I've done readings on like Crowdcast or Zoom or something like that, it's just been completely dead. And so we do the thing where we're doing the Q&A instead, and it's a lot, for me, it's a lot better, and I think for people it works as well. So just learning how to do this thing and make it work and be interesting to people has been fascinating in and of itself. So
Right. This is not my gift, so it's been a learning curve.
You're doing great.
It's okay.
Great. I think we're having a good time.
I'm having a good time. I should probably get to some of these questions
Sure.
people are asking. So let's see. I see the classics movie poster behind you, wondering if there are any classic science fiction films that may have influenced your writing.
You know, hold on. I will show you something that I think is kind of interesting. I'm back. I'm just over here. So I actually wrote a book on science fiction film, which is called The Rough Guide to Sci-Fi Movies. It's out of print now because Rough Guide stopped doing stuff other than travel stuff, which in today's world has not necessarily been a great idea for them. But so, and I was a film critic actually for a number of years before I started writing novels. So yes, not just science fiction films, but in fact, film in general has been hugely influential for me in terms of how I write. So, like for example, one of the things you might notice about my books is that they are extremely dialogue heavy, right? There's just a lot. I mean, I don't do a lot of exposition. I do a lot of conversation. And so, and that comes from the fact that for 6 years, full time being a movie critic, I was basically looking at story as it was done cinematically. So it had a huge influence when I came down to actually starting to write. So I got so used to story being, you know, being discussed and rather than being, you know, described in paragraphs and paragraphs. That really had an effect. And also, like for example, the humor of the books is a lot of cinematic humor comes from that. In terms of the ones that I would say are kind of the most obvious. So for Old Man's War, one of the things that I have in the acknowledgments is I acknowledge Robert Heinlein because Old Man's War is Starship Troopers with old people, right? You know, it's pretty much exactly what that is. But it wasn't just Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers that was an influence. It was also the Paul Verhoeven movie from 1997, that had a huge influence in terms of when I was thinking of scenes, particularly battle scenes. I would be thinking of them cinematically, and one of the touchstones for that was actually how Paul Verhoeven not only like staged those battle scenes, but the way that he basically cut up his main characters like they were cold cuts. You know what I mean? He gave you a movie where the first 40% of it was meeting and spending time with these really young, really hot people, and they were literally meant to be eye candy. This is the way he works. They were meant to be eye candy. You were meant to not only just identify them with them as protagonists, but to like them and to desire them. And then having done that, in his very first battle scene, he chops a whole bunch of them up, with the aliens. And that sort of brutal mercilessness of having created these beautiful bodies and having made you desire these beautiful bodies and then destroying them. One is underappreciated cinematically in terms of what he was doing in that film, but also for me was a real clue for me about how to treat those battle scenes, because in that sort of sense, as a writer, I did want you to identify with those characters. I did want you to like them. I did want you to appreciate them. I did want you to feel like they could be your friends. And then they had to die, because that is the nature of war. It's, war is violent, war is chaotic, and nobody gets a pass. Everybody can die. And so in a weird way, both Starship Troopers, the book, and Starship Troopers, the movie, had substantial weight in the development of that particular book. So that might have been more of an answer to the question than I think you expected. But yes, cinema plays hugely in how I write books and how I develop them.
All right, I'm going to come back to your new book. So as I was reading about it and reading about the series in general, I noticed that a lot of readers have noted parallels to the series to the current world we live in, which happens, with sci-fi, and sometimes
Sure.
they call it, prophetic. And while I don't dispute the idea that you may be a prophet in modern times, is the series based more off of your own like observational living, or is it more of like a fictional progression of how current issues can just develop into these crazy things that aren't so crazy down the road?
Sure. I mean, the thing I always tell people, so I have another book which is called Lock In and Head On, and both of those, there's a virus that sweeps the globe, right? And there's a novella in particular in the series called Unlocked, where I describe the progression of the disease. And it pretty much matches, and I wrote that in 2014, and it pretty much exactly matches the development of COVID. So people are like, "Are you a prophet?" And I'm like, if I could tell the future, I would not be writing science fiction. I would be investing in the stock market, because that's where it would do me some good. So I can't say that I'm a prophet. And with particularly this next, the Interdependency series, there have been a lot of people have seen a lot of parallels to climate issues, to the issues of good governance, towards how the 1% views the rest of the world and their own priorities, and so on and so forth. And in each of those cases, it's not about being prophetic, right? Same with the lock-in. It's not about being prophetic. What it is knowing how humans work. And science fiction really often gets a bad rap about understanding the human condition. We like to say science fiction, it's the literature of ideas, but it's always had that rap of it's literature of ideas because the characters are cardboard. And I think there's something to that historically, that there was, particularly in American science fiction and particularly in the golden age of science fiction, that there was much more of a privileging of really interesting concepts over a character, and a lot of the characters were if not cardboard, they were cut out of the same cloth. They were all competent men doing competent things competently. Occasionally a crisis would happen, and then they would find a competent way to fix it. There would be some incompetent people who would be problematic for the competent person who was our hero, but in the end, competence will out, right? And that kind of was, that's kind of, it's a valid criticism of a lot of science fiction from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was eventually a reaction to it in the new wave of science fiction. And I have to say, these days, in the era that we're living in now, starting about 2000 moving forward, the diversity of writers and the diversity of viewpoints coming in has made a huge difference in how character develops. And one of the things that I've really noticed in 21st century science fiction has been a real focus on believable humans in unbelievable situations, because science fiction is still about weird stuff happening, and and there's supposed to be a rational basis to it, but so on and so forth. But the characters have become generally, on average, more believable, and I think that is part and parcel of what I do as well. I mean, I spend a lot of time watching people. I was, again, before I was a novelist, I was a journalist and I was a columnist. And so much of what I was doing was observing people and talking about what people were doing and why they were doing it and trying to figure out their motivations and all that sort of stuff. So when it came time for me to be a novelist, I had literally spent a decade and a half watching people do things and figuring out what it is why it was they were trying to get into their heads. So, and one of the things that I've kind of learned about humans is we don't change all that much. We're kind of running the same software that we were running 10,000 years ago. Circumstances change. We're talking through a magic box that, transmits our image through video. And, people 2,000 years ago were talking around a campfire, but it's still the same storytelling, because the types of people that were alive then are the types of people who are alive now. So if you had some understanding of who humans are and how they relate to each other, and not just how individual humans relate to each other, but how groups work, how castes work, how the divisions in a society work, all that sort of stuff, when you run them through whatever scenarios that you imagine, and you keep those things in mind, then you see them do somewhat realistic things. And that is the part that sounds like prophecy. But again, it's not prophecy. It is just understanding how people work, and understanding how, if you are a conglomerate or if you are a company, the very last thing you want is to change the way that you do things just because somebody has found a flaw with it. Right? And it's like, you're poisoning the ocean. It's like, yeah, let's put a study group on that. And then have the study group go for 30 years and never reach any particular conclusion. But at least you're doing something. So, that sort of thing is, so when I write in the Interdependency about, they know the collapse is coming. It's coming. Everybody knows it's coming. But everyone's like, but do we really have to do anything about it now? I'm not, again, it's not predicting anything. It's just like, this is exactly what we're doing right now. It's like, the ocean is turning into an acid, right? That like the shells of creatures are not forming because, the calcium is not calcifying. They're all turning into soft shell crabs. And people are like, yeah, let's do a study group. So, right. So as far as it goes, not a prophet, just an observer. What can I say?
A less heavy question.
Sure.
And this comes in from Android's Dream Book Club, which is our sci-fi book club. There's a few of those folks watching tonight.
Hello, folks.
Having written military science fiction, have you had a military background, or are you doing intense research to bring that realistic approach to the writing?
Right. I have not been in the military. However, my brother was a Ranger and he was in the first Gulf War. My father was in submarines during the Vietnam War. My wife's father was also in the Navy. My wife's cousin was also in the Navy. I come from a family, and my wife comes from a family where military service was extensive. So that did two things for me. One, it made it so that I did not discount the quality of service and the commitment to service that people have, which can sometimes happen when, for example, you have the generally liberal, generally pacifist politics that I personally do. So knowing people who have done service was a huge advantage, and having that as part of my life growing up also mattered. That said, yes, I also did a bunch of research, particularly with Old Man's War. I did not only I did two types of research. I did some very abstruse high-level discussion or research of what is war, what is service, what does it mean to be a soldier. So you'd have books like, The Face of War by Keegan, and Victor Davis Hanson, who also did lots of books on wars and battles and things like that. So a lot of research basically into how war has been waged over the millennia, so that I had a abstruse background of what it meant to go to war. And then I read stuff that was very sort of grunt eye stuff. I read, Joe Haldeman has a book called War Year that was the first book he ever published. It was not science fiction. It was actually a book that was written in simplified English, 1,500 words he was allowed to use. The same 1,500 words over and over the course of a novel. And the reason that it was commissioned was to get people who were, I believe, adults who were trying to improve their literacy, to give them stuff that they could relate to read, so they weren't just reading kid stuff. And so, like, I read that. I read Boot, which was a book that was specifically about what it was like to go into Marine boot camp for the 6 to 8 weeks that it took to do Boot, because I knew that I was going to have a boot camp scene, and I didn't want my boot camp scene to be just repapering over what the Marine boot camp experience was. It was not meant to be one-to-one. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to get into my brain what it was like and what was the goal of boot. It's not just about physical, it's about mental training. It's about indoctrination, not necessarily in a horrible way, but sometimes in a horrible way as well. And again, the whole idea was not to get specifics that I would just be like, I will cut and paste and put those into the book, but to get the overall concept of it, to the overall taste of it, the overall gestalt of what it meant to have all that sort of stuff. And then having done that, then to distill that into something that, while Old Man's War and the other military science fiction that I wrote is not a one-to-one analog of any war that we've been in, I wanted it to be something that someone who had been to war, who had been in service, would be able to recognize and go, yeah, no, that makes sense that they would do that 400, 500 years in the future. But again, it comes down to respect service, respect what service means. And respecting what service means and respecting the people who have had service means taking the subject seriously, so that even if you don't have that experience yourself, when someone who has reads it, they can be, if they don't believe, even if they know that you didn't have it, they can see that you respected it and that you know people who have.
Right. Okay. I want to, earlier before we went live, I showed you my husband's copy of Fuzzies and the Other People.
Yeah.
So he wanted me to talk to you quickly about that. So I'm going to ask, what prompted you to, I hate to say resurrect H.B. and Piper's Little Fuzzy series for a new generation?
Right. It was the way that I called it a reboot, right?
That's better.
In the sense of, because that's pretty much what it was. There's a long and convoluted story for this, which was so about 2008, a book deal that I had fell through. There was I don't know if you remember 2008, but there was a global economic collapse, not quite as bad as the one we have now, but pretty bad. So a book deal that I had under development at the time kind of just got tubed, and all of a sudden I didn't have any books, and I was kind of annoyed by that, as one frequently is when something that you thought you'd be doing, and all of a sudden the rug goes whoop, and then you're not doing it anymore. And so I was fortunate that I had other stuff to do, and that I wasn't going to start, so that was great. But I was like, well, I guess I'm not doing that novel, and I guess I'm not doing novels for a while. What do I want to do with my free time? And one of the things that I wanted to do, and this goes back to one of the things that we were discussing earlier, where we were discussing the golden age of science fiction. And the golden age of science fiction, American golden age of science fiction, like I said, 1940s through late 60s. Great books, great stories, great everything, but also very much products of their time. And this isn't a criticism. The Old Man's War through the last, the new book, The Last Emperor, they're all books that are a product of their time. 30, 40 years from now, people will read them and be like, oh yeah, no, you can tell this was written in the early 21st century, because my values and, the things that I am concerned about and so on and so forth are all reflective of the time that I live in. But what it means is, so if you pick up a book from, Little Fuzzy was written in like 1959, came out in 1961. And it's a really good book, but it's also very clearly a product of its time. The competent man doing competent things competently is there. It's very man heavy. There are female characters, but they're definitely all support staff, all of that sort of stuff. And for someone who is a new reader of science fiction, or who's not reading it for an academic reason or for completionist reasons, a lot of golden age science fiction is kind of difficult to attach to, because you're reading stuff that is in the past, and not so far in the past that you can just divorce yourself from it. Like, people read Austen and Shakespeare and they don't be like, well, that's, I can't relate to that, because they know it's so far in the past. It's like a U shape of, I can relate to this now, and then there's like a gap of about like from 40 to 80 years in the past where you're like, no, it work for me anymore. And then after about 100 years, you can start reading it just to read it, and you're like, yes, that was a different time. And so a lot of golden age science fiction is really at the bottom of that U right now, where you read it and you're just like, no. No. And so I was kind of curious about what it would be like to take a golden age science fiction story and write it from the viewpoint of someone who is in the 21st century. And so I was thinking about that, and I wasn't going to write, and this was all very sort of a personal thing. Like I wasn't doing it to get it published. It was just more of my own curiosity. Like, I want to see what it would be like to write one of these things. And the reason I picked Little Fuzzy, aside from the fact that I really liked that story, is that Little Fuzzy, for various tragic reasons that need not be gone into right now, is in the public domain. So the copyright had never been renewed. And then so once the copyright stuff got extended and so on and so forth, it wasn't covered. So I could legally write it and not have to worry about someone's estate coming to stab me in the night. So I wrote it basically for my, like I said, for my own kind of curiosity, for my own interest. Of what would it be like to take this story, because it is very much the same story that H.B. Piper did, but update who Jack Holloway is, update the other characters, update what the Fuzzies are and what their motivations are, and so on and so forth. Write it from the viewpoint of a 21st century writer, not the viewpoint of a mid 20th century writer. And so I wrote it, and I really enjoyed writing it, which was also part of it, because when that deal fell through, I was kind of pissy, right? And so I wanted to write something that I could connect with actually the joy of writing again. And this was my way of doing that. And so I finished it. And I was super happy with it. I was like, well, now I know. And then my agent, Ethan Ellenberg, called me. He's like, what are you doing? Because here's the thing about agents: if I don't give them stuff, they can't sell it, and if they can't sell it, then they're not making money. And so I said to him, I was like, I just wrote something that you are never going to be able to sell. And his response was, challenge accepted, send it to me. And so I sent it to him, and he was like, you know what, I think we can work with this. And one of the things that we actually did was, even though it is public domain, and I did not need anybody's permission, right, to publish it. Literally, that's what public domain means. It's like I could just do it. We contacted the Piper estate, and we gave them the manuscript. And I was like, I've written this. We want to publish it, and but we don't want to publish it if you hate it. If you hate it, we'll just put it in a drawer somewhere. And so the folks at the Piper estate read it, and they actually liked it. And so we got an endorsement from the Piper estate. They're like, yes, we're aware of it. We like it. Thumbs up. Go ahead and do it. And that's how Fuzzy Nation became a officially endorsed reboot of Little Fuzzy. So, like I said, very long, very convoluted story. But the happy ending is for a lot of people having read Fuzzy Nation, because in the book I make it very clear in the forward and in the afterwards. I'm like, look, this is based on this novel. You can find this novel at Project Gutenberg or in a bookstore or somewhere else, and why not read that one too and do the compare and contrast for yourself to see the difference between what someone writing contemporaneously mid 20th century and someone doing the same thing in the 21st century. What's that like? What I think would be kind of interesting is like in 2061, right? If somebody did another spin of it, for the same reason that I did it in 2011. Why not?
Why not?
Why not, indeed?
Are there any other, would you want to do this again? Are there any other series or authors you'd want to dive into?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one, because the reason I did it, which was, what would this be like? I now will know what the answer to that is. So I've done it. Should other people do it? If other people had an interest in it, I don't see why not, as long as they're not, I mean, to be clear, people play in other people's universes all the time. When it's unofficial, it's fan fiction. When it's official, it's media tie-in stuff. And in both of those cases, I think is perfectly fine. I know that there's fanfic of stuff that I've written, which I think is super cool. I'm glad people like it so much they want to play with the characters. But the instigating purpose of it for me has already been explored, and so I'm not hugely interested in doing that. I have been approached to do tie-in work before in various universes, and most of the time I've kind of passed on that. Not because I'm a snob about it or anything like that. I think there is the one bit of snobbery that I knew about in science fiction going into science fiction was that some people who wrote original fiction would look down at the people who wrote tie-in fiction, which I think is ridiculous, because it's harder to write tie-in fiction than it is to write original fiction, because tie-in fiction, they give you a Bible. It's like, here are all the things that you have to do. Here are all the things you can't do. The rules are so much more complex that anybody who can actually write a really entertaining story while adhering to all those rules, I'm like, I am too lazy to do any of that. So that's part of the reason that I don't do that, but also because I'm interested in developing kind of my own original material. But I have a lot of friends who have done tie-in stuff. Lots of friends did Star Wars books. I had one friend write a Predator novel. And in each of those cases, it's like, did you enjoy it? Did you get paid? Was it a good time? Cool.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any plans to write for television? Did you write 39 episodes for Stargate Universe? Is that right?
No. I was the creative consultant for
Okay.
the 2 seasons of it, and so I didn't write anything on there. If there was going to be a 3rd season, there we were talking about me writing an episode. But no, what I did for Stargate Universe was, so when you go to a convention and they are talking about Stargate, or they're talking about Star Trek or any TV series, and there's that and they go to, now does anybody have questions? And then some guy raises his hand. It's like, in season 3, episode 15, you had this thing happen, but in episode 4 of season 2, it was clear that such a thing could never happen. So I was wondering, how does it feel to lose track of your own series? You know that guy, right? I know
my
you know
life
that
at
guy.
home.
Right. So my job as the creative consultant for Stargate Universe was to be that guy before that guy could be that guy. They would send me the scripts, and I would go through them, and I would be like, no, this doesn't make sense because 2 episodes back you closed that, you can't do that. And I would offer a suggestion of what they could do instead, or if the science was not quite right, not the speculative stuff, but the actual science that we know was not right. Or character notes, like in the 1st season, I got a lot of scripts where people were just like shooting guns all over the place. And the thing about Stargate Universe was it took place on a ship that was a 500 million light years away from anything. So every bullet they used was a bullet that they wouldn't have again, and they did not bring an infinite number of bullets with them, right? So it was like resource. I was the guy who was counting the bullets. The other thing is if you go back and watch Stargate Universe, you'll notice that not a lot of people die on it, but they're horribly injured, right? And that's again because I was like, you keep killing off all these characters. By the end of season 1, you will have 6 people on the ship, right? So they couldn't kill them off, but they could just really mess them up a whole lot. So those were the things that I was doing there. I have written scripts, and I have done some stuff for TV. If you watch the Netflix show Love, Death, and Robots, 3 of the episodes of that are based on short stories that I wrote. And there's going to be a 2nd season. And I can't talk about my involvement in it, but I can say I'm really looking forward to the 2nd season. And then that's pretty much all I can say about that at the moment. But and then we have other things in development. There's a Stargate Universe, not Stargate, excuse me. There's the Interdependency TV series is in development. There's a Old Men's War movie in development at Netflix. And in neither of those cases am I directly writing the script, but I am an executive producer on both of those things. And so I'm involved in building the universes of those as well. So I'm fairly active at the moment doing TV and film stuff, and that's kind of fun.
Wow. All right, let's see. We have another. Okay.
Another question.
This is about red shirts, of course.
Sure.
Okay. There should be a red shirt series. Have you been approached by producers to make a series or movie based? We just talked about that. I guess specific to red shirts, maybe. Is there anything in the works?
So it's been optioned a couple of times, and in both cases, it just didn't happen. So in both cases, we got to a point where we had a script, and the network that had optioned it, same network actually, they had optioned it one time. They were going to do it as a miniseries. The script came in, it was fine, but then they had a change in management, and they decided to go in a different direction for the stuff that they were doing. So what can you do? Then a year later, they're like, hey, remember when we optioned that thing from you? Can we option it again? And I'm like, will you pay me? And they were like, yes. And I was like, then yes.
Okay.
Okay. And that time they were going to do it as a recurring series. And that was right around the same time that Orville was starting up. And I think the feeling was that there was going to be too much of a overlap. But as it turns out, Orville became its own thing, and it really wasn't exactly like what Red Shirts was at all. So, and every once in a while, somebody comes back around with it, And the thing about Hollywood is that stuff there will always be interest. Sooner or later, somebody will option stuff. they'll go into a round of development. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. And it's, it's hard to say anything about what makes things work and what doesn't. Like Old Man's War has literally been in development for a dozen years. First, it was going to be a movie at Paramount. Then it was going to be a TV series at Sci-Fi. Now it's going to be a movie on TV on Netflix. And in each of those cases, it's sort of like, great, let's see what happens. And the thing is like when you're writing novels, right? Like, because I write novels, it's literally me in a room and I have total control over it. And the only thing I have to worry about is when I turn it in, what my editor is going to say. But even then, it's a very discrete process. It's me, it's my editor, and then once that passes muster, then out it goes. It's very tightly contained. When you are doing movies or TV series, it's not just me, writing a script and then handing it to a director. It is somebody coming to me saying, hey, can we option this? Now we got to hire a screenwriter. That screenwriter's got to, turn in something. A whole bunch of people are going to give them notes, including me, right? I'm going to give notes. The potential director is going to give notes. Potential producer is going to, potential network's going to give notes. That poor bastard now has to go back with 17 people's notes and try to make them all happy. This is one reason why I'm not hugely invested in being a screenwriter. And, and then once you do that, then that repeats. And then it keeps going until somebody's happy. And then they greenlight it. And that can take years, or it won't happen at all. There's so many places for it to fall apart. And part of the reason of that is simply that, if something gets greenlit and all of a sudden literally millions or hundreds of millions of dollars are on the table all of a sudden, that's so much money that, everybody has to sign off on it. Whereas with a novel, it's like, it's chump change compared to what happens with movies. It's like, a few $1,000s or, a few tens of thousands of dollars in most cases. So the risk is much lower with novels, and the risk is so much higher with movies and TV. And so that's why, out of 100 things that get optioned, 99% of them will never get greenlit. And of the 100 things that are greenlit and make it into production, 99 of them are just going to disappear off the waves and nobody's going to see them. Only one of them is going to be a big hit. For that 1% that hit it, then life is great. Look at George Martin, who, by the way, had a career that had a whole bunch of highs, and then he put out a novel that cratered, and then for years and years and years he didn't have another book come out until finally he put out the Game of Thrones books. It took 20 years for those to become a TV series, and then of course it became what it became. So nobody knows anything. It's the actual honest truth.
That's the moral of the story.
Yes.
Nobody knows anything about anything.
Nobody knows anything.
Okay. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and we had a few questions come in through Instagram. Instagram. So let's see here. Do you have any advice for the next generation of writers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you are just starting, the secret is putting your butt in chair and writing. And also, and I think this is really important, you got to give yourself permission to suck. And, let me give you an example. So I have a stringed instrument here. This is a ukulele, right? And the first time that you play a ukulele or you play a guitar, you don't expect to be a genius at it, right? But the thing is that, and people know that you're not going to pick up a guitar and all of a sudden be Jimmy Page, right? Or that, or that you're going to become the world's best chef when you've never, grilled a sandwich before. But people do seem to think that the very first time that they write a novel or try to write a novel that they're going to get it right the first time. And the answer is no, you're probably not. It takes a while to actually develop all those skills. So there's going to be this period where you're just going to suck. You're just going to suck. And it's not just you. Everybody sucks when they first start doing anything, but writing in particular. And so you just give yourself permission to be not good, and don't worry about it if you're not good. because what happens is that's a period where you get to actually play with stuff, right? That you can be like, well, I'm going to try to write a poem, and don't worry about it being good. You just try it to see if you actually enjoy writing poems. If you do, maybe write some more. And if you don't, you're like, well, then I don't have to write any more poems because I don't like it. Try science fiction, try romance, try Westerns, see which of those you like. Give yourself permission to do a whole bunch of different things and not be good at them. And then once you find the things that you like, keep working on those. And then sooner or later, the more you practice, the better that you get at them until finally you're actually good at it. But you have to give yourself permission not to be good, because otherwise you'll get disheartened and you will stop. Don't stop, actually be okay with the fact that you won't be good for a while and just keep going. And do it every day so that not every day, but on a regular basis, so that you develop the muscles. Just like if you are playing a stringed instrument, you learn how to do the chords, and you practice the chords, and you practice all the other sorts of stuff so that you commit it to memory, as opposed to, having to think about where to put your fingers. So yeah, continually work on it and give yourself permission to suck.
Okay. And which science fiction authors have influenced you the most?
Well, I mean, Heinlein's obvious because, Old Man's War is very clearly patterned after his work. There are, and it's kind of hard to say in the sense of, are they influences in terms of how I write, or are they influences in terms of they were the writers that I read and I really enjoyed, so I wanted to write science fiction. And in the case of the latter, there are people like Sherry Tepper, or Dan Simmons, or Neil Stevenson, or Douglas Adams. I don't necessarily write like any of those people, but I enjoyed the stories that they wrote so much. And when I was a kid, Susan Cooper and Madeleine L'Engle, both were incredibly important to me as a reader. And having those people putting ideas into my head meant that sooner or later, when my ideas started coming out, even if they weren't the writers that I necessarily directly emulated, they were still incredibly important to me in terms of development of who I am, eventually becoming a writer of fiction myself.
And one more question.
One more question.
One more. What are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading, actually, one of them is right here, which is called The Most of Nora Ephron. Nora Ephron is, for those of you who don't know, she was an essayist and a journalist, and she also wrote and directed movies, most notably Sleepless in Seattle. She also wrote When Harry Met Sally. And she's one of my writing idols. So I didn't know that this compilation, which is basically just a huge, like 1,000-page book of stuff that she's written, was available until last week when a friend mentioned it on Twitter. I'm like, immediately bought that. I've also been reading Nora Jemisin, rereading actually City We Became, which is great. I've been reading Otaku by Chris. Oh boy, and I'm gonna Chris Cluey. And the thing is I get so many books that come in because I have that thing called The Big Idea, where people write about their books on my website. And so I get all the books that are sent, and I get so many more books than I can actually read. And I always feel like, but they're all so enticing. And I feel like there's that fable of the donkey who starved to death between two piles of hay because he couldn't decide which one to go eat from. And I have all these books in the house, and I'm like, oh, I want to read that one. Oh, but I want to read this one too, and oh, I want to read that one. So lots of choices to make. But those are the things that I'm reading right at the moment.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was an absolute delight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And you were a very good conversation partner. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. If anybody would like to purchase, and I encourage you to, The Last EMPEROX or any of the books in this series, please click the button on your screen that says purchase book here, and you can do that there. Thank you again. It was wonderful talking to you, and good luck with this book.
Thank you. And bye, everybody. Thanks for showing up. Take
Bye.
care.
Thanks, everybody.